Well, today we have special guests here from Parkland Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And they are here to share with you what God has done in their life. First to speak will be Jeff, and then afterwards will be Darius. So, Jeff, you'll come forward and just share with us how God has been working in your life.
I'm glad you don't want me to sing, Anyways, yeah, I'm Jeff Boyer from Louisville, Kentucky, in Parkland Baptist Church. Just a little brief backstory, whatever, I guess. When I was a small kid, my mom and dad, we used to go to church, and with my brother and sister and everything. That's like so many people in our country have done throughout the ages and everything, When I was real little, we went to Walnut Street Baptist Church. It was one of the larger churches in our city, of course. And then as things got, progressed on, whatever, I guess, my sister went in the hospital, my mom's in the hospital, stuff like that. Life goes on and everything. And we quit going to church for a while, a few years and everything. And then I had a friend of mine down the street. Family moved in down the street, and I played with their son a lot and everything. And they invited me to church, Parkland Baptist Church. And I was a little familiar with it from another neighbor went there and everything, but I'd never been there before. I knew where it was and everything, but so I went, went to Sunday school and I enjoyed it. Went a few times, and then next thing you know, mom, dad, and my brother and sister started coming along too. So that's one, amazing way we see how, we get people in the church. A lot of times it's through the kids come and visit, and that's one thing what we try to do with our church, help out, do our Bible schools, try to draw in a lot of families that way and everything, and it's one of our missions of our church to try to help out with our Bible schools and backyard Bible studies to try to draw families in and everything. But anyways, I was about 9 years old. We've been going back to Parkland for a few years by that point, and about 9 years old when I professed Christ, when I was saved and went forward and everything. And we still went there a few more years, and of course the teenage years hit, and like so many of us, you start worrying more about your neighborhood friends, your and school friends and everything like that, and you start falling away from the Lord, from Christ and everything. So I quit going to church, and got into a lot of trouble, high school, cutting classes, getting suspended and everything like that, causing the trouble that you do and everything. And of course I got into a little bit of drugs, a lot of my friends got into alcohol real bad. Fortunately, I didn't really care for beer much or anything, so I kind of avoided that trap like a lot of people did. But of course, for me, it was just mostly marijuana. And I think that took a lot out of my life and everything. That I missed a lot of opportunities because I didn't want to go through school, didn't want to, get into a career. You just get in the where you're just kind of existing in life and everything. You don't really want to do much anything. It takes a lot out of you and everything. But fortunately, I say in a lot of ways, now I look back and say fortunately, but in 1997 I was about 26 years old, and I actually had a mental breakdown. I was diagnosed with bipolar. And at the time, of course, that's one thing you don't want to have happen to you or anything. You don't want to have bad circumstances or be, any kind of disease or illness or anything like that affect your life in any way. But now I can look back and see how it was a blessing. It helped me, realize that I needed to make some changes in my life, and ultimately made me grow up. Realize that life doesn't, life's not just one big party. You have to take on responsibilities in your life and everything. And a couple of years later, I think the Lord was really drawing on my heart around that time and everything as I going through those changes. It would have been a really good time to start going back to church, that's for sure. My dad was still going to church at the time and everything. But I could still feel the Lord pulling my heartstrings. And finally, I guess about 5 years after that, I was thinking, because I was working Sundays at UPS, and I was like, well, I need to make some changes. I need to start going to church every now and then. At the time, I didn't have to work Sundays. It was just double shift days, whatever. But I started thinking, well, I'm missing a lot in my life. I need to start going back to church, And over the course of the year, I was, started going back to church. It came to be a weekly thing. Started doing it everywhere. First is every couple of weeks, and it started becoming a weekly thing. Started getting to know people a little bit, and for probably the first time in my life, I really got really interested in reading the Bible. Before then, like I just read the scriptures out of kind of like a duty or anything, but this time I really got, more interested in it, where, reading into the stories and actually studying in it and everything like that. So I think that was a pivotal point in my life, and I started going back to Sunday school then, with at the time we didn't have a class in my age range, for a large part. We just had the college and career class. They put me in there, and I got to meet a few people and everything. And from there, they wanted to open up a class from really my age range, from 25 to 39 at the time. And so they asked me if I'd like to lead that class, and I'd already made it a point where I wanted to teach and everything, and it's just to try to learn and everything. So we started that class, and going in, you have these big plans or big dreams, whatever, going in, that hey, I'm gonna have a lot of people coming in. Everyone's gonna be learning a lot and everything. Well, it didn't actually work that way, And there's a lot of times that we started out with about close to 10 people, but like I said, a lot of times it'd draw back and everything. And there was for a long time there, I didn't have anyone come to class for the most part. Occasionally, I'd have one or two people come. There's a lot of weeks I just had to. Okay, no one in my class made it in. I had to go over to another class and participate with them and everything. But I think the Lord works with you a lot that way, because it kind of teaches you the perseverance. I wanted to keep the class going just to try to, because I knew there were still people to reach, and if I can connect with people in a way that other classes weren't doing, I thought maybe that'd be a good thing. Well, over the course of time, we started getting a couple people coming in, and we ended up getting about 5 or 6 steady people coming, pretty much every week. I could count on them and everything. And the good thing is that I've still talked to those people, to this day. We still have good relationships. Sometimes we'll still go out and eat and stuff like that, even though everyone's kind of moved on from now, to that point. It's like a couple in my class, we moved out to Shelbyville, and it's about a good half hour, 45 minutes away from our church and everything. So, but just stuff like that, people grow, they had to take on different responsibilities, life changed and everything, so they moved on from the church. But I always treasure that time, because you see that a lot of times you think, okay, well, I'm failing because I'm not getting a large class like I anticipated to have. I didn't have 20 people, 30 people like I was wanting, like when you go into it. But a lot of times you get those little special relationships, and sometimes it's just a matter of you get one person come in and they really just need to hear something, they need a friend and they need someone to talk to and everything. And I think that's really important in our ministry. Is like a lot of times it's not about just reaching out to large numbers of people or anything like that, or being popular or doing the thing. Sometimes it's just that one person that you can help out. And oftentimes that person helps out you too, helps you work through some of the difficulties in your life and everything like that. But, the one thing, as my responsibilities changed, I had take care of my mom and dad. Around that time, I started going back to church. My mother, it's going back, the story for her, sorry, but the time I started going back to church, my mother, she started getting Parkinson's disease. And she'd fell a couple times, fractured her ankle, and the next thing you know, she was wheelchair bound. So, all right, at that point, I had wanted to start going back to school, maybe to get an education, and because at the time I was working, well, I'm still working at UPS, and it was just a part-time job. And I thought, well, I wanted to get something better career and everything. Well, that's a set of circumstances that arise that all of a sudden you realize that, I can't control this or anything, and I had to take on this responsibility. And because my dad, there's no way he could have taken care of her, pick her up, and stuff like that. So, like I said, a lot of times those things happen in life. It changes your plans that you had going on. Well, in 2009, she passed away, and of course, it was very tough. And since it was opened up for me to be able to have more time to, work more longer hours and everything, I was able to take on other positions at UPS and have more time during the day, and eventually it ended up leading to a full-time job. So, but unfortunately, when I went full-time, I had to start working back on Sundays again. And the challenges with that was, I had to give up my Sunday school class and had to go to church at nighttime instead of Sunday morning and everything. And that was really tough to do, But through that, one thing that really Lord leaned on me was to really look at the people I work with, for one thing, to find out, as you talk to people, they find out there's a lot of other Christians working with you and everything, oftentimes a lot of Baptists, and I think that really helped keep me spiritually connected to the Lord during that time, too, where I didn't feel like I was able to fulfill my church duties in many ways, like I wished for and everything. But I could also, during that time, it also made me want to focus on looking for the needs of people around me, people I work with, and oftentimes to the community, and maybe think about ways I could serve them. And oftentimes it was just a matter of just listening to their trials they're going through in life, the circumstances they had to face and everything. And also, a lot of times, just simply pray for them. I think a lot of times you run into the kind of habit of you hear someone tell you there's some problems and everything. You think, okay, well, I'll pray for you later. I'll take the prayer to Sunday school and we'll pray for you. But a lot of times we can just say, hey, I'll just take a moment right now, Mom, we pray together. Can I pray for you right now? And I think that makes a big impact on people. And I think it's one thing we look at the way the Lord worked, in the Bible stories in the Bible, the way He's worked and everything. A lot of times He works through our circumstances. A lot of times we have circumstances we want to be removed from them. They say in my case with the bipolar, and then later on take care of my mother in a wheelchair and everything. Yeah, I wanted a miracle. I wanted to not have to deal with any kind of mental illness or anything like that. I would have loved if my mom was able to just get up and start walking again and everything. But a lot of times the Lord gives you these circumstances, and He just shows the way that He loves you during those circumstances. The things where you can, learn to care about people, not just, just simply when I was younger, I wanted to kind of be popular, have lots of friends. When I started the Sunday school class, I wanted to have large amounts of people be around. But then I say you learn a lot more of the more important things, the simple day-to-day things. How, like I say, going back to the circumstances, like you look how the Lord worked in Jonah's life. He had a mission for him to go, deliver the message to Nineveh. And of course Jonah didn't want to do that, and that's the way we are oftentimes. That's the way I wanted to do, especially when I was younger. I wanted to run from all those responsibilities. I didn't want any part of it, But then, like I say, you see that, the Lord was still, He had a purpose He wanted to go through, and He didn't want him to avoid that, and so He let him go through that period of time. And I'm trying to think what I was saying. I'm sorry, but I think a lot of that is just the growth that we have in our life, is that we, sometimes we start pretty immature and everything, but then a lot of those circumstances we had to face and everything, a lot of times, they help us grow. And, oftentimes we just realize that, we're not going to be the best person to do that thing. You know, there's a lot of people maybe more well-spoken, more well-educated. Some things we might have to do, they may be stronger or whatever. But a lot of times, you know, the Lord uses you in the situations you're in. And I think that's the way he really works with me in my life, is finding those situations in each and every day that I'm, you know, whether just at work, you know, the people I'm working with, or if I'm going to a grocery store. A lot of times I have the Walmart greeters, I sit there and talk to them for a while, you know, and a lot of times, you know, they'll tell you about what's going on in their day, and a lot of times you make really good connections with people. And I think it's really what a lot of times what life is all about. You know. Anyways, I don't have a lot to say. I just kind of went off the speaking off from my heart a little bit, but I want to thank you all for having me here to speak. And I think I'll turn on over to Darius here, if you don't mind. Sorry.
Thank you, Jeff. And I normally don't carry water into the pulpit. I apologize if that's offensive to anybody. I'm barely hanging on to my voice, so I'll try to make it through here. I've got a bit of a scratchy throat this morning. Sometimes if you're asked to give a testimony, there's so many things that go on in your life that you could share that's just the right thing for somebody at just the right time. We've just met. I don't know what just the right thing to tell you is, but I want to share just a couple of stories from my life that gives you an idea of how God has shaped my life and turned me into the person that I am. And I guess to do that, you have to realize that my young life, I was the quietest, shyest, wallflower type of a person that you could ever imagine. That's just who I was. And I was raised in church. My mom took me to church every Sunday. I wasn't a preacher's kid, but pretty close to it. I was there every week. And I think sometimes that's the kid that has the hardest time deciding that they need to make a profession of faith, because you kind of feel like you're already doing everything. You're acting like all of those people. You're following them. You're doing this. And so for me, I was 16 years old when an evangelist came to our church, and something that he said just helped me to realize that, yeah, you're acting like everybody else, but that isn't really what Jesus is looking for. What Jesus is looking for is a close relationship with you. And in the days and weeks that followed, I began to realize that I've been acting like all of these other people. I did the right things. I felt like I was. But I really wasn't doing it because I was speaking to God. I was doing it because that's what everybody else was doing. I was just very fortunate that the crowd that I had connected with were doing some pretty good things, so that was okay. But it took me a while to realize that God is still reaching out to me to have a direct one-on-one relationship with him. So 16 years old, I walked down the aisle. I accepted Christ. I honestly didn't expect any big changes in my life. I thought I was already where I was going to be. God, having an incredible sense of humor, decided that he was going to bestow me with the gift of leadership. Now, imagine, you mentioned earlier about the spiritual gifts, and I think that he can do this at any time, but I think for a lot of people, he begins to place that spiritual gift that you have when you first come to salvation. It certainly happened that way with me. And so when I'm this shy little kid that sat in the back corner, that I was the invisible one. I literally I went to birthday parties. I have a good friend who I still keep up with. She had her 16th birthday party. She's got dozens of pictures from her 16th birthday party. I'm not in any of them. I was there. I knew all those people. Literally I was invisible, okay? So that's just the way that my personality was. But in the days that would follow coming to Christ, opportunities began to come to me, fall into my lap, where somebody needed somebody to help them take the next step, whatever that was. And I didn't realize at the time that God was putting me in situations so that I could help people make informed decisions on how to take the next step, how to be a leader with them in a godly way. And so it took me a while to realize that that's what God was doing in my life. And I didn't really know how to use that, but I began to see a pattern in my life of falling into situations where the group I was in, whatever group that was, needed somebody to guide them so that they wouldn't drift off into things that they shouldn't be doing. You know, I got married, had a couple of kids, two fine young men. I was 45 years old now, and things are just going through life as you do, and making a decent wage, but things had happened, and I found myself in a financial crisis. And I'd never had anything where I absolutely couldn't work through it, because I was always the one that people came to that said, help me work through this project. I suddenly found myself in a situation where I couldn't work through it. Try as I might, I couldn't work through my financial crisis. And I wasn't going to be able to make my house payment. Now, as a young father and recent husband, that was devastating for me. I mean, I was the one that I wanted my family to be able to look up to me. And I thought I was doing all of the right things. I had a job, I was going to work, but circumstances in life had kind of built up on me, and I just ran into a crisis time that I couldn't work through. And I remember realizing I'm going to have to call the mortgage company, and I'm going to have to tell them I can't make my mortgage this month. I just can't. I'm $2,000 short this month, $2,500 actually. And I had fallen behind. I was at work, and I thought, I can't even do this from my office. I've got to go, hide someplace and make this phone call. And cell phones were a brand new thing back then, and I had a big, giant cell phone that I just got. But that's probably part of the $2,500 crisis now that I look back on it. But I got in the car, and I drove over to a nearby lunch place, and I sat in the car, and I reached for the phone to make the call to the mortgage company, and I reached for it again, and I just couldn't bring myself up to it. And so I stopped and I prayed, and I said, God, you have always helped me to help others, to lead others to do these things. And I have prayed to you a million times, God, help me to do whatever, fill in the blank. And in those moments, I realized that that's the wrong prayer. And in that moment, I realized that the prayer that I needed was, God, let me follow you wherever you will lead me. Don't go along with me and help me to do what I'm doing. Let me follow you into what's next. I don't know what's next. God, this is brand new territory for me. And I sat in the car and I prayed, God, let me follow you. This is bigger than me. I can't do it. First time in my life I'd ever admitted to that to anybody. And I prayed to God. I said, God, give me the strength. You guide me. I will follow you. You tell me what to do. This is bigger than me. I'm giving it to you, and I would like to follow you and show my faith in you through this. And again, I reached for the cell phone, and it rang. I about jumped out of my seat, to be honest with you. I just got my nerve up to call and say I couldn't make my mortgage, and after having this prayer time, and I picked up the phone, and it was a business associate. I was an architect and had consulting jobs with people back and forth. This guy called me and he said, I've been thinking about you, and I want to know if you would be willing to do this consulting job for me. It pays $2,500, and I need it over the next 2 weeks. And I didn't know what to do. I mean, I was like, I knew instantly that this was God's answer to my prayer. I don't usually get answers to my prayer within the 15 seconds, after I say, Amen, God. But I sat back and of course I accepted the job and was very thankful for it. Gary to this day still doesn't know that he was an answer from God in making that phone call to me. But I realized that the difference in that moment was that I had fumbled through this spiritual gift of leadership and misused it by saying, God, help me to take the next step forward. I'm going to do this. Help me to be strong in doing it. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And in time, he had to set me back and say, wait a minute. I didn't give you the gift of leadership so that you do what you want to do. I gave you the gift of leadership so that you would follow me and bring others with you. And so I encourage you, if you haven't taken that retrospective look, to consider in your prayer life, are you praying for God to follow you? Or are you praying for opportunities to know how to better follow God? That's certainly been my testimony. I want to tell one other story, just because I think it was a way that I was truly able to see God work through my life. And I'm going to go back to May 1st, 2001, 20-something years ago now, 2001. It was a Wednesday night, about 9 o'clock. On Wednesday nights, my wife and I both went to church. We had Wednesday night services. I came from work. She came from home, so we had separate vehicles. One of my sons hadn't been feeling well this night. He had stayed home. My younger son was traveling with my wife. So we were returning from church in separate cars. I happened to be a little bit ahead on this evening. And I got home, walked in the doors right at 9 o'clock. And as I had gotten out of the car, I began to notice the clouds were getting kind of ugly. I live right off the Ohio River, and so we get some squalls that come up from time to time. And I thought, oh, there's going to be a pretty good storm coming up here. So I mentioned I did architectural consulting, and I turned my dining room into an office, and I went in, I sat in my desk there, and I turned on the answering machine to see if I had any messages, and turned on the computer to check my email. And I didn't usually do this, but I turned on the radio because I noticed that the weather was getting kind of bad, and I turned on the radio to see about the storm. And the guy on the radio, the first words out of the radio when I turned it on was, there are tornado warnings in Goshen, Kentucky. Now, that's where I live. And I turned and looked at the radio. I tell people it looked like a Gilligan's Island episode. I turned and I looked at the radio and I said, what? He said, to repeat, there are tornado warnings in Goshen, Kentucky. And I thought, man, I was just outside, and I looked out the window, and a storm came up from the riverside coming towards my house, and large hail began to just pummel the back side of my house. And as I sit in that chair looking, I thought, this came up really quick, and this is a really bad storm. We probably ought to go to the basement. I was arrogant enough to not usually go to the basement, but we did. My son sitting at the other end of the house. I stood up from that chair. I walked to the other end of the house, and I said, Mason, we probably ought to go to the basement. The storm's coming up. And before those words had really fully left my mouth, a tornado set down in my yard, in my home, and completely destroyed the home that I lived in and was standing in with my son. It happened. Have you ever taken a paper bag and blown it up and then made a big popping noise with it? Well, imagine that being inside the house, that your house is the paper bag. It just, in that moment, it just imploded in on top of us. So I can remember looking down the hall, and I saw a field of white powder blowing towards me. This all happened in an instant. And it was the blown-in insulation above the ceiling, where when the trees from the tornado had landed and crushed our home, it just was racing down. It permeated every fiber of cloth and in the piano strings and everything that you can imagine. And my son and I stood there, and we looked around us, and we stood in the only room in the house that wasn't completely annihilated by the storm. All this happened in seconds, if that long. And we went back down to the other end of the house. We didn't know this at the time, but the roof was completely gone. The trees we lived in a wooded area, and the trees are this big around and a couple 100 feet tall, and it had plucked them up by the roots. I mean, live, healthy trees, root balls as big as this area. I mean, they're huge. And it just picked it up out of the ground and thrown it onto the house. It threw it onto our motor home. It threw it onto my truck. It threw it onto my son's car. It just absolutely flattened and crushed everything we owned in a moment. We lived through it fine. My wife, fortunately, had not gotten far enough that she was endangered by it. She and my younger son had pulled off the road to wait the storm out. And Mason and I tried to salvage anything that we could in that moment. It was right at twilight. So it's very eerie. You can almost see, and everything is sort of surreal because it's right at where it's turning dark, and you can, shadows look like real things. You don't really know exactly what you're seeing, and it was just really hard to imagine the immediate transformation of my world in those few seconds. So over the next weeks, months, whatever, the insurance company sent people to help us with the cleanup and all the various things. And this very well-meaning young lady met me a couple of days later. She was with a crew that was going to come and try to sweep up all the debris and just clean things up. And she was trying so hard to say something kind. And she said, "Mr. Powell, I am so sorry that this has happened to you." She said, I do this kind of work all the time. And she said, this is just so much devastation here. She said, I do this, and this is even heavy by the standards I'm used to. There's so much devastation here. And she said, it's hard to imagine that all of this is from what the insurance companies like to call an act of God. And there's this epiphany that hit me in that moment and in that conversation. And I spoke to her, I can't remember her name now, and I said, this is a storm. This was a storm. Let me tell you about the act of God. We're standing in the front door of what was left of the front door of the house, and I said, see that chair right there? The one that the tree is crushing to the ground? It's come through the roof. It's landed in that chair. 15 seconds, maybe not even that long, before that tree was in that chair, I was in that chair. And a voice spoke to me and said, you need to go get Mason and go to the basement. And I stood up out of that chair and I walked not 30 steps down the hall, and boom, all this happens. The largest tree of the mess landed in the chair that I had been sitting in. And I looked at her and I said, that was the act of God. That was God acting on my behalf, and I didn't even know it. I didn't even see it until I began to reflect on this. We had a small motorhome at the time, and our tradition was every summer in the springtime when we were beginning the season, you'd winterize it for the winter. In the spring, we would always have to take the battery charger out and plug it up and charge the batteries on it and all. And this year I decided I would get ahead of it a little bit, and I would actually take the battery out of the motorhome, put it in the garage, put it on the charger, let it sit there for a couple of days. Did that the day before. That was on Tuesday. This is on Wednesday. That night, the motorhome was cut in half by one of these trees, driving the power center where the battery was into the fuel tank. Crushed the truck, drove the power center into the fuel tank underneath. By God's providence, I had taken the battery out the day before. There was no power in the power center to spark an arc and cause an explosion or any kind of burning, because some voice told me, instead of, after the last 9 years, you always brought your charger out, stuck it on here, take it out, do it different this time. Take it inside here. That's the act of God. That's not my act. I didn't do that. I wasn't smart enough to know to do that. But as I reflect on the experience that we went through and the time that we had in opportunities to reflect on that, there were so many acts of God in that entire incident. I can't be sad about losing my home. Insurance paid for it. We got it put back together. It took forever, but I can't be sad about that because it showed me an aspect of God that I didn't know about before. I'd been a Christian my whole life, and I never took the time to stop and look and say, God is at work in your life right now, doing things for you that you will probably never recognize. And I wouldn't have recognized if this catastrophe hadn't come along and gave me the opportunity to look back on it and realize that that storm wasn't the act of God. That storm, it's a storm. We all face storms. The act of God was how he prepared me for and how he walked me through that and how he kept me safe. Mason and I were in the only room in the entire house that wasn't destroyed. We stood upright, talking, having a conversation like we are now. Everything around us was completely annihilated in a moment. I think that was the act of God. I think he saved me that day. And because he saved me that day, I think he has a purpose for me. And because he undoubtedly has a purpose for me, I'm standing here talking to you. I don't know if that was my purpose. I don't know if that's what he had in mind, but I suspect he had in mind that he wanted me to share my experience so that others can be encouraged to understand that God is at work in your life, even when you don't know it, even when you're not aware of it. If you take a moment and look back over the last week, what interesting little coincidences can you come up with that have happened in your life this past week alone that you may not have recognized was God's activity in your life causing tragedy to avoid you this week? Some little thing came up. That car that turned left instead of right and didn't total your car. I mean, just little things that we'll never even know the extent of how God is working in our lives, minute by minute by minute, and yet he's right there. Every minute he's guiding our lives if we give him that opportunity. I encourage you, from my life experience, I encourage you to acknowledge that God is seeking us to follow him. He's calling us to follow him, and he will give us the strength that we need when we are following him for his purposes, and his activity will be most easy to observe in your life when you realize that God is calling us and I'm following him, and he is making clear the way ahead of me. So I'll stop with that, Randy.
Thank you very, very much. I would like to add that the passage I was going to just mention briefly now is one I've mentioned before, but something was just added now. I was going to bring up the end of John chapter 6, in which the people who were fed, the 5,000 plus, all left him. So remember the story. Jesus fed the 5,000 men plus. And then the next day the people followed Jesus and said, "Do it again. We want free food for the rest of our life." Jesus said, "I didn't come for that. I want a relationship with you, and I want to be in complete control of your life." They all said, "Phooey with you," and they all left. To which I was going to share this morning, we'll remember what Simon Peter said. He said, when Jesus turned to the 12 and said, "Will you also go away?" And his response was, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and are sure that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Then it just hit me for the first time a moment ago. What happened between the day before when he fed the 5,000 and that episode? And the answer was the storm. The storm that was so bad they were yelling and crying out all night long. And then Jesus shows up and walks on the water. After that horrific storm, Simon Peter said to Jesus, "To whom else can we go? You have the words of eternal life." Which is the point I wanted to bring up to you guys. Is Jesus real to you? Can you honestly say what you desire more than anything else is a relationship with Jesus? We've heard a few testimonies just now. I'm sure there are many more for all of us. Would you like to live the rest of your life so that he is real and that a day-by-day experience, even in storms, you can recognize the presence of God and want him more than anything else? If so, would you bow your heads and let's commit to him now. If it's the desire of your heart to recommit to your life and to have a daily walk with the Lord, a daily experience with Him, would you commit that right now in your prayers to Him? Our Father, you are worthy of our life, and certainly we ask that you would help us with our twisted worldly mindsets, that we think that we desire nothing but comfort and pleasures and resources. But you see life from a totally different perspective, that just being with you and having you, there's nothing else to desire. As the psalmist said, you are my shepherd. What else do I need? May that be the desire of our heart. May we have a lifestyle of testimonies every day because of our experiences with you. Please do a good work in our lives, and we look forward to seeing what that will be. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.